April 11th, 1945. 10 o'clock in the morning. Buchenwald concentration camp on the wooded slopes of the Ettersberg Hill outside Weimar, Germany. The order came down from the SS command staff to every remaining guard on the grounds. Leave. American armored columns had been closing on Weimar for days, and the men who had run this camp for 8 years understood exactly what that meant for them personally if they were still standing at their posts when the tanks arrived. What they didn't fully understand, standing in the watchtowers giving that order, was that they were no longer the only ones inside Buchenwald with a plan for what would happen next. Buchenwald had existed since 1937, one of the largest camps built on German soil, holding political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, and Jewish prisoners transported in growing numbers as the war ground on. It wasn't classified as an extermination camp in the way Auschwitz or Treblinka had been. There were no gas chambers built for mass killing on an industrial schedule. But the distinction meant little to the roughly 56,000 people who died there over 8 years from starvation, disease, medical experimentation, forced labor, and execution. Death at Buchenwald simply took a slower, less mechanized form than it had further east, which made it no less deliberate and no less total for the people it killed. By early April, nearly 48,000 people were still held at Buchenwald, a number swollen in recent weeks by thousands of exhausted prisoners marched in from camps further east that the Soviets had already overrun: Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, camps whose own evacuations had turned into death marches long before they ever reached Buchenwald's gates. Commandant Hermann Pister, who had run the camp since January of 1942, had already begun trying to erase the evidence of what those 8 years had produced. On April 7th, he'd ordered the first mass evacuation to begin. Prisoners marched to the rail station and loaded into open boxcars bound for Dachau, a transport that would come to be known among survivors simply as the death train. It took 20 days to reach its destination, prisoners dying of starvation and exposure in open cars the entire way, some killed when Allied aircraft, unaware of what the train carried, strafed it from the air. By the time the offensive at Buchenwald reached its final hours, roughly 28,000 prisoners had been forced onto marches like that one. Close to a third of them never survived it. What the SS command staff didn't know was that Buchenwald had an underground resistance organization years in the making, the International Camp Committee, made up of prisoners who had quietly secured positions in the camp's own administrative offices, positions that gave them access to information, to movement between blocks, and eventually to weapons smuggled in piece by piece and hidden where the guards never thought to look. Members came from across occupied Europe, French, Soviet, German, and Czech prisoners among them, men who had spent years learning exactly which guards could be bribed, which supply runs offered a chance to move contraband, and which administrative loopholes let them build something resembling an organized command structure inside a system explicitly designed to prevent exactly that. They had built, in secret, a working shortwave radio transmitter and a small hand-crank generator to power it, hidden well enough that 8 years of SS searches had never found it. On April 8th, at noon, 2 members of the committee used it to send a message in Morse code, repeated in English, German, and Russian, addressed to the approaching Allied forces. "This is Buchenwald concentration camp. Requesting help. The SS wants to destroy us." It was in the truest sense a message in a bottle, sent with no certainty anyone capable of acting on it would ever receive it. Transmitted from a hidden generator inside a camp still fully under SS control, by men who understood perfectly well what would happen to them personally if that transmitter were ever discovered. Someone did receive it, but before help could arrive, the resistance intercepted something far more urgent than the fate of their own message. A transmission from German High Command instructing local officers to prepare explosives, enough to destroy the entire camp complex and every prisoner still inside it. Erasing the evidence of Buchenwald as completely and permanently as the death train was already erasing the witnesses who might otherwise have testified to what happened there. If the SS couldn't march every prisoner out before the Americans arrived, the order made clear they were prepared to make sure none of them survived to describe it at all. If you want to hear the stories that show you exactly what people were capable of in the war's final, most desperate hours, the ones who tried to erase the truth and the ones who refused to let them, subscribe. We find these accounts, we verify them, and we tell them exactly as they happened. The camp committee moved fast once they understood what they were racing against. Through April 9th and 10th, they distributed the weapons they'd spent months and years smuggling and hiding, quietly arming small groups across different sections of the camp, coordinating without ever tipping their hand to the guards who still, technically, controlled every watchtower and gate. It was an enormous risk. Discovery at any point in those 2 days would have meant immediate execution, not just for the men caught holding weapons, but likely for entire blocks of prisoners the SS would have targeted in retaliation. They moved anyway, because the alternative, if the explosives order was carried out before liberation arrived, meant certain death regardless. On the morning of April 11th, when the order finally came for the SS to abandon their posts, the timing could not have been more precise. Around noon, the commanding SS officers fled the camp entirely, driving out ahead of the approaching American columns rather than risk capture. The guards left in the towers, suddenly without officers to answer to, and with the sound of tank engines growing louder in the distance, began abandoning their positions too, one after another, until watchtowers that had overlooked the camp for years stood empty. The very system of control that had held tens of thousands of people in check for years dissolved in the space of a few hours, the moment the men enforcing it understood their own survival no longer depended on staying at their posts. At 2:30 that afternoon, tanks of the U.S. 4th Armored Division rolled through the edge of the SS complex, moving fast toward Weimar itself. Not even stopping, the scouts leading the column had no idea yet what they were passing, focused entirely on the tactical objective ahead of them rather than the compound at the edge of their route. What they didn't see was that inside the wire, armed prisoners were already moving. The camp committee's fighters overpowered the remaining guards, seized full control of the gatehouse, and began rounding up any SS personnel who hadn't managed to flee in time. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the prisoners themselves held the camp. 76 SS men who'd been too slow or too unlucky to escape were now prisoners of the men they'd been guarding an hour earlier. Buchenwald had been liberated from the inside before a single American soldier had formally set foot through its gates to claim it. Reconnaissance Officer Paul Baudet, one of the 4th Armored Division scouts, was among the first Americans to actually reach the camp itself, arriving by jeep around 5 o'clock that evening to find not a camp under German control, but one already secured by its own former prisoners. Weapons still in hand, 76 captured guards held under armed watch by the men they'd spent years abusing. Soldiers of the 6th Armored Division, part of Patton's 3rd Army, arrived shortly after and found more than 21,000 survivors still inside the wire. Among them roughly 900 children and teenagers who had been hidden in secret compartments and underground spaces by other prisoners specifically to keep them off the death marches in the camp's final desperate days. Word of what had happened at Buchenwald reached 3rd Army headquarters within hours, arriving in the same stretch of days that General Dwight D. Eisenhower was already absorbing what he'd personally witnessed at Ohrdruf, 60 miles away. What made the report from Buchenwald land with particular force wasn't only the scale, nearly 10 times the population of Ohrdruf, but the detail about the explosives, a piece of the story that made clear this hadn't simply been a system running down in disorder, but one still actively planning its own final act of mass killing days before it finally collapsed. Eisenhower's staff understood immediately what that meant. The SS hadn't simply been retreating in disorder. They had been prepared, right up to the war's final weeks, to destroy every remaining witness, rather than let a single one survive to describe what had happened inside that wire. If the resistance hadn't moved when it did, if the Americans had arrived even a day later than they did, the accounting the world eventually received from Buchenwald might never have existed at all. Eisenhower's response was immediate and specific. Get everything documented before a single body is moved, he told his staff, extending the same order he'd already given at Ohrdruf. Photographs, film, testimony, gathered as fast and as thoroughly as it could be gathered. Track every member of that command staff, he added. If they were prepared to destroy the evidence rather than let it survive, I want to know we can find every one of them, no matter how long it takes. Medical units, including the Army's 120th Evacuation Hospital, arrived within days to begin the desperate work of treating survivors whose bodies had been pushed to the absolute edge of what starvation and disease could do to a human being before killing them outright. Later that same month, at Eisenhower's specific request, a delegation of American congressmen and journalists made the same journey to Buchenwald that others had already made to Ohrdruf. Standing in the same barracks, hearing the same testimony, ensuring that what had happened there would exist as permanent, undeniable record rather than a story that could be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration in the years to come. Commandant Hermann Pister didn't wait around to be found. He fled the collapsing German lines and tried, like thousands of other SS men in the war's final chaotic weeks, to disappear into the anonymous mass of German prisoners of war being processed by the Allies. It worked for exactly 2 months. American investigators, working from the wanted lists and testimony gathered at Buchenwald itself, tracked him to a prisoner of war camp near Munich and arrested him in June of 1945, ending an attempt at anonymity that depended entirely on nobody looking closely enough to notice who he really was. Nearly 2 years of investigation followed before the case was ready. On April 11, 1947, the exact second anniversary of the camp's liberation, the Buchenwald Trial opened before an American military tribunal at Dachau. 31 defendants stood accused. Pister himself, Josias, Prince of Waldeck-Pyrmont, the SS officer who had overseen judicial matters connected to the camp, 3 camp doctors and senior SS medical officers, block leaders and detachment commanders, and Ilse Koch, widow of an earlier commandant, whose own alleged conduct inside the camp had already made her one of the most notorious defendants awaiting judgment anywhere in occupied Germany. More than 450 former Buchenwald prisoners were called to testify, traveling back to Dachau, itself a former concentration camp now repurposed as an internment and trial facility, to describe under oath exactly what they had endured under the command of the men now sitting across the courtroom from them. 2 full truckloads of the camp's own administrative documents, records the SS themselves had generated and never fully managed to destroy before their officers fled on April 11th, were entered as evidence against the men who had signed them, providing exactly the kind of undeniable, self-incriminating paper trail that no surviving witness testimony alone could have guaranteed. The trial stretched across 4 months, one of the longest and most complex of the entire Dachau proceedings, weighing not just the direct killings and abuses documented at the main camp, but the administration of an entire system of forced labor, medical experimentation, and calculated starvation that had operated for 8 years before its final, nearly catastrophic attempt to erase itself in a single afternoon of explosives and fleeing officers. On August 14, 1947, the tribunal delivered its verdict. All 31 defendants were found guilty. 22 were sentenced to death by hanging, among them Hermann Pister, the commandant who had ordered the death train and stood ready, in the camp's final hours, to erase the last of the evidence entirely if his own men hadn't fled before the resistance and the Americans arrived first. He never faced the gallows. Pister died in Landsberg prison of a heart attack in September of 1948, before his sentence could be carried out. 12 of the other death sentences were ultimately carried out. 8 more were commuted amid the same shifting Cold War politics that would later reduce sentences in the Malmedy case as well. Ilse Koch's original life sentence was commuted to 4 years, a decision that provoked outrage on both sides of the Atlantic strong enough that German authorities retried her independently in 1950, sentencing her to life imprisonment a second time. She remained in prison until her death by suicide in 1967. The survivors of Buchenwald carried what they'd witnessed and endured for the rest of their lives, many of them going on to give testimony not just at the 1947 trial, but in the decades that followed, ensuring the record the SS had tried to erase with explosives in April of 1945 remained permanent and unambiguous instead. Some who had held weapons during those final hours of the camp's existence rarely spoke of it publicly afterward, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, how narrow the margin had actually been between the liberation the world eventually learned about and the total erasure the SS had been prepared to carry out instead. A camp oath, drafted by survivors in the days immediately following liberation and read aloud at a memorial gathering, committed those who remained to continuing the fight until every person responsible stood before judgment. A promise that the 1947 trial, imperfect and incomplete as its aftermath proved to be, at least partially fulfilled. A memorial stands today on the Ettersberg Hill, near the same gatehouse where 76 SS men were held under guard by their own former prisoners on the afternoon of April 11, 1945, a place where for a few critical hours before any American soldier arrived to claim credit for it, the people the Nazis had tried hardest to erase were the ones who saved themselves, and in doing so, save the evidence the rest of the world would eventually need to understand exactly what had happened on that hill. Visitors today can walk the same grounds where a hidden radio transmitter once carried a desperate message out into a war that was, by then, only days from ending, a message that reached the people it was meant for in time, if only barely to matter. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that show what it actually took to make sure the truth survived, sometimes from the very people the system was built to destroy, subscribe, and stay with us. We'll keep finding these accounts, verifying them, and telling them exactly as they happened.